Once again, this is our invasive species discussion panel. We will have 4 short presentations and then open up the panel for discussion, questions and answers. And our first presenter is Cheryl Hamilton, who is a co-founder of Balcones Invaders of Texas program in San Antonio. Cheryl has been a member of the San Antonio chapter of NPSAT since 2008 and an Alamo area master naturalist since 2007. Cheryl co-founded the Balcones satellite of the Invaders of Texas program in 2010. Since inception, teams of volunteer scientists have eradicated more than 200,000 invasive plants from city, state, and national parks in the San Antonio area. Cheryl has presented more than 100 invasive and native plant workshops at the local, state, and national level since 2009. She is an instructor for Alamo Area Master Naturalist Program and for the Native Landscape Certification Program in San Antonio. For 3 months every summer, Cheryl volunteers as a visitor protection ranger at Big Bend National Park. Cheryl received a Presidential Lifetime Achievement Award in 2015 for contributing more than 4,000 volunteer hours to the Master Naturalist Program. Please welcome Cheryl Hamilton.
I'm so happy that all of you are still here. You know, the last program of the day, it's difficult to keep the focus, so I really appreciate your being here. The same holds true for our Zoom listeners. I hope that they're still logged in. So Chris is going to be my Vanna White today. He's going to switch the slides for me. But I'd like to start with one story. As Chris said, I became a master naturalist in 2007 and Native Plant Society member in 2008. At that time, my son, who was 15 years old, said, "Mom, how much longer are you going to be eradicating invasive plants?" And I said, "For the rest of my life." And so those of you that work in your backyard, in parks, preserves, in larger landscapes, you know that we will never fully eradicate the invasive plants. What we will do is manage them and continue, with the help of researchers like the folks behind me, continue to come up with new solutions. I have the honor to be the first speaker, which basically means I get to do a quick overview. And so sit tight, because we're going to move pretty quickly through the key concepts, and then we'll pass it on to the rest of the panel. On a global basis, the 2 great destroyers of biodiversity are first, go ahead, back to where we were. Yes, first, habitat destruction, and second, invasion by exotic species. Of course, this is the late E.O. Wilson who started to make those connections. Keep in mind everything that's in red. First, habitat destruction, and second, invasion by exotic species. The official definition is an invasive species is defined as a species that is non-native to the ecosystem and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So when people ask me why invasive plants are a problem, I always come back with those same 3 things. These plants cause or are likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. Why do plants become invasive? Favorable environmental conditions, starting with disturbed sites. We know that when we disturb a site for whatever reason, the first thing that comes back are the invaders, because the others take a little longer to get established, and sometimes it's too late. We also know that floods, particularly in an area like Texas, Central Texas, San Antonio area, we live in flash flood alley. So we know that every now and then, and with increasing frequency, we have these catastrophic floods, and everything that's upstream goes all the way downstream, and these invasive plants move very quickly from one ecosystem to another. We also know that a lack of natural controls, such as herbivores, parasites, and diseases. As I was reviewing my notes for this program, I discovered that tamarisk, salt cedar, has 350 insects who feed on it in its native habitat. And Kelsey's going to be talking about salt cedar today, and I'm guessing that we don't have 350 insects in this habitat that eat salt cedar. We also know that there's a lack of competitors, a lack of the plants that co-evolved with these invasives, and so it's kind of like carte blanche. They have complete access to disturbed sites. Go ahead. Okay, how do invasive plants cause harm? Go ahead. So first of all, we know as native plant people that they displace and compete with native plants. And these native plants are the core, the basis, the foundation of our biodiversity. They're the basis of our food chain. So if they displace the very plants that we need for our animals and our wildlife to survive, then we're in big trouble. They also alter hydrologic conditions, fire patterns, and soil characteristics. And in these discussions that we've talked about today, several folks here have talked about fires, in the increased wildfires, in the increased hot and basically devastating wildfires. Many of these plants, these invasive plants, are very, very flammable. We'll talk a little bit more about that. They alter the hydrological systems. The entire Rio Grande is altered because of Arundodonax and salt cedar and other invasive plants. And the soil characteristics. You've all heard the word allelopathic, which means chemicals that are released by plants to stunt the growth or stunt the germination of other plants. That many of these invasive plants have allelopathic chemicals that basically outcompete every other plant. And last but not least, we've seen this in every single ecoregion of Texas, particularly in places of large landscapes like the Pecos. We see them forming monocultures, shading out the light, the nutrients, the water that the native plants need to survive. Additional reasons for causing harm. Again, remember, folks, it's about the food. If we don't have the native plants that these insects have co-evolved to eat, if we only have monocultures of invasives, then our biodiversity goes downhill. Many of these plants, the insects don't even recognize them as food. The diversity of animals in a particular habitat is directly linked to the diversity of plants. So you can have all the most beautiful plants in your yard, including invasives, but if they're not food for the animals, then we're up a creek. Many invasive plants are toxic to livestock and wildlife, and particularly as I was reviewing the many grasses that we talk about in West Texas. Many of these grasses, not only are they not palatable, but they are toxic to our animals. They will kill our sheep, our cattle, our goats, and our horses. And it's important for the people who own ranches, who own properties, who manage preserves, to know which plants are toxic. And again, many of these invasive plants are highly toxic to the wildlife. How did they arrive? We know most of these on purpose or with unforeseen consequences, even though we had good intentions. By government agencies or landowners for flood and erosion control, wind barriers, and livestock grazing. Most of you know the history of many of our grasses. They were introduced in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s to help with range management long before we knew that we have now created a culture which is a sea of the wrong grasses, as Forrest Miller stated. We know that they arrive on construction or ranch machinery, the boots and clothing, myself included, of hikers and ranchers during flood events, on contaminated seeds or hay mix, and migration of wildlife. Many, many, many ways for these invasive plants to catch a ride, to hitchhike to a new environment. Okay, we're going to focus on 9 invasive plants today. We're not going to describe them, but these are the 9 that we chose as a group that are most detrimental to the Trans-Pecos. The first two, salt cedar and giant reed, Kelsey is going to be talking about her research in these areas. Raise your hand if you don't know or haven't heard about salt cedar and giant reed. Okay, I've got a couple hands out of a group of 100. We also know KR bluestem, layman lovegrass, bufflegrass, cheatgrass, Johnson grass, Bermuda grass, all these wrong grasses. Caroline is going to talk about many of these. Last but not least, African rue, which is a shrub, herbaceous perennial shrub, but that one is so toxic that you cannot even burn the wood and be in the vicinity of the smoke. This is called the invasion curve, and many of you have seen this before. This basically talks about when a plant first arrives. So we know that a lot of these plants arrived at the beginning of the 19th century, some of them even as long ago as the 17th century. But the ones that are problematic right now in the Trans-Pecos, most of them arrived in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. At first, they were great. Gosh, they're providing, habitat, forage, and so forth. But eventually we realized, oh my gosh, what happened to the bluebonnets? What happened to the Mexican hats? What happened to all the wonderful forbs, vines, and trees that were native to that habitat? So then we get to a situation where, okay, well, let's just get rid of those and we'll be fine. But that doesn't happen soon enough in many cases. So then we get to a situation where we have increased abundance, and now we simply try to contain it. If we can, we fence them in, or we cut down a small portion. But then we're at a problem, as you can see in the red zone, where we're now at a point where the spread is way beyond the scope of anything that an individual or even a small group can do. Let's talk about management and control. Many of you have had invasive plants in your backyard, and you know that you can pull them. You can use a chainsaw or DeWalt saw or something mechanical. You can use chemicals, although I personally don't use chemicals in my yard, but we certainly do find it necessary to use chemicals in conjunction with other management strategies when we're looking at large-scale properties. Prescribed burns, in many cases, have become an effective strategy. Grazing, we talk a lot about grazing with goats, but I'll tell you what, that has to be very carefully managed, or you end up with nothing, as we know, with goats. So we have to be very careful. If we're going to graze goats for invasive species, we've got to teach them which plant to eat and which one to leave alone. Next slide. Restoration. I cannot emphasize that enough. Do not cut something down in your yard or in the preserve or in the park unless you know what you're going to put in its place. Because the first thing that will happen is that those invasive plants will be the first to return. We've got a dilemma, and many of you know this dilemma. You can still buy a lot of these plants in your local nurseries. Thank you for the independent nursery owners who absolutely are not selling invasive plants. Bufflegrass is one of the worst invaders. It's also the most heavily sold seed in South Texas. We see the same thing with ligustrum. We see the same thing with lilac chase tree, many invasives that if they're not banned at the state level, they're still being sold in the nurseries. Okay, so we have some special challenges in the Trans-Pecos. Many of the speakers have discussed this. We have a very complex ecosystem. And I don't know about you all, but I am so impressed with the brilliance of the people in this room and the way that they get the big picture. This is an incredibly complex ecosystem. And then we add the layer of invasive plants on top of that. You can see that we have our work cut out for us. We also know that, go ahead, Chris, that we have large areas that are inaccessible. And certainly the people who are walking these properties, 100 acres, 500 acres, 1,200 acres, 800,000 acres. We know that these folks have a huge challenge in number one, identifying and locating these plants, and number two, managing these invasive plants. We also know that we have multiple private and public entities, including binational relationships. We have an incredible opportunity on the border to work in conjunction and in coordination with our neighbors. But it's easier said than done. A lot of programs are started and dropped for political reasons. We also know that large numbers of threatened, endangered, and rare species exist in this very special area. And gosh, we just don't need to have invasive plants compromising the issues that we're already struggling with. Okay, remember back to, one more back, Chris. So if you don't leave with any other thought in your head, I want you to remember that invasive species can cause or are likely to cause economic or environmental damage or harm to human health. And the last slide shows a group of called the Salsa Squad. Raise your hand if you've heard about the Salsa Squad. Okay, we've got a few folks. So the Salsa Squad was a group that was started about 12 years ago. And basically, we decided we're not going to just identify the plants that are invasive. We're going to do something about it. Our motto is stop the spread, spread the word, just do it. And that's the group that over the past 12 years has eradicated more than 200,000 plants. We've spent a lot of time on our hands and knees. We've spent a lot of time in collaboration with parks, preserves, both nationally, locally, and statewide. And I would urge you that if you have a passion for helping us in this process, get together a group of folks, get your snake guards on, get your reciprocating saws and your loppers, and you'll have a blast. Next slide. And remember, oops, can you go back to that one just one more time? Okay, the last thing I'd like to point out, which all of you know, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Thank you.
Oh, no, is Kelsey next?
No, I'm next.
Okay.
I think.
What's that?
Do you think this reaches?
It's really hard to see this in the dark. If you hit this side, it's not going to.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. That was really good. Tough one to follow. I'm going to dive into a particular topic that Cheryl talked about, which is this special relationship between non-native invasive grasses and wildfire. And that was the bulk of my PhD dissertation. And so it's something that I would love to share with you. It's something I feel very passionate about. So how many of you know your invasive grasses here in West Texas? A little pop quiz for you. Just look at these pictures for a moment. I was going to say maybe you saw some of these yesterday on your field trips, but I actually really hope you didn't. But maybe you saw them along those sides of the road. All right, we got number 2 is KR. 4 is Johnson grass. Buffalo grass is 3. Love grass, number 1. You guys are great. Got them all right. Number 2 probably is KR, but maybe it's Kleberg. I haven't ID'd it. So these are the 4 probably the more common invasive grasses that I see in Big Bend National Park, excluding the riparian area, which I'm going to leave 100% for Kelsey. So when we think about invasive species, there's 2 different effects that invasive species can have. And this is just going over what Cheryl's already said. One of them are the direct effects, where the invasive species are directly competing with native species for things like space, light, water, and nutrients. An example of that is King Ranch bluestem here in Central Texas. You can see there are no native species growing in this picture because it is completely dominated by KR. And in this case, the invasive species are out competing the native species. They're having a direct effect. But another thing that invasive grasses in particular are very good at are these indirect effects, which are changes to ecosystem properties such as erosion rates, litter accumulation, and fire regimes. And fire regimes are what I'm going to be speaking about. A fire regime is the pattern of fires for an area. So usually we think about the frequency of fires every year, fires every 100 years, but it also includes characteristics like the patchiness of the fire, the intensity, whether the fire stays on the surface level or gets into the canopies of the trees. These patterns are what make up the whole fire regime. And so what invasive grasses do, they have an effect on the fire regime, which in turn has a negative effect on the native species. So it's this indirect effect. Invasive grasses are very good at changing fire regimes because they are well adapted to surviving fires. Perennial grasses have this tissue that is protected called meristem, which you probably have heard that term, where meristem is generally protected during fires, and from that tissue, they can resprout new leaves. So here's an example of a bunch grass that was burned, and it's now resprouting new leaves from that meristem. Annual grasses can survive fires if their seeds are not consumed by the fires. A really well-known example of the problems with wildfires and invasive grasses is bufflegrass in the Sonoran Desert. It's gotten a lot of study. And typically the fuel loads in the desert are between 0 and 700 kilograms per hectare. As you can see on the left, there's a lot of open spaces in between the shrubs, and maybe some annuals come up when it rains. But where you have areas where bufflegrass is invaded, the fuel loads jump up to 2,500 kilograms per hectare. And in turn, this creates more frequent fires, more intense fires, and that is harmful to the native species and it kills them, which opens up more space for more bufflegrass, and you have this positive feedback loop. So as I mentioned, the changes to the wildfires caused by bufflegrass are higher fire temperatures because you have more fuel. You have faster moving fires because of the way bufflegrass just burns really well. It stands up and the fires can move through it really easily. You have larger fires because the fuels are more continuous. You have these big patches of bufflegrass opposed to small little pieces of fuel that can burn in a native ecosystem. And you have more frequent fires because bufflegrass can resprout really quickly. We had the same problem here in West Texas in the sense that bufflegrass is increasing our fuel loads and changing the way fuel loads are distributed across the landscape. Here's a picture in Big Bend National Park where you can see sort of in the background, kind of on the left-hand side of the picture, this is desert pavement, so a lot of open spaces in between the shrubs. But in the foreground, there's a little drainage, and bufflegrass has come in and it's increased the fuel loads. It's made the fuels more continuous. So if you did get a fire, it would be able to spread much further. It's just a very dangerous situation. Bufflegrass is not only a problem for native ecosystems, it's a problem for our human structures as well. We had a fire in Big Bend National Park in 2019, and one of the contributing factors for that fire was the bufflegrass and that continuous fuel load that caused historical structures to burn down. And here you can see on the top, these invasive grasses have no problem going in the parking lot around these structures. So it's, as Cheryl was saying, they like disturbance. They have no problem living in these really tough places. And this increases the fire risk. I want to pivot. This is a bit of a disjointed presentation. I apologize for that, but I really wanted to also talk very briefly about the research I've done on using fires to control invasive grasses. So a really big switch. We have this problem here in West Texas and in other arid ecosystems where too much fire is a problem and too much fuel is a problem. But in Central Texas, where the ecosystems are better adapted to more frequent fires, we can actually use wildfires to control invasive species. And the species I worked on was King Ranch bluestem, Bothrioclois shaemum, variety sungarica, and here it is. You all recognize it. If you don't, these are some of the features that you can look at to clue you in about this particular species, the area of the panicle, some close-up pictures of the ligule, and you can see those hairy nodes that sometimes you get on KR. So we did a study at the Balcones Canyonland National Wildlife Refuge where we burned at different times of year to see what time of year would be the best time to burn to control King Ranch bluestem. So I used replicated plots. I had 8 replicates per treatment. We burned in February, April, August, October, and had a set of unburned controls. And we found that fires in August and October were extremely effective at killing King Ranch bluestem. And that's what was actually going on. Plants were dying because of these fires. And because this ecosystem, the native plants are well adapted to frequent fires in this grassland savanna of central Texas, they were not set back by these fires the way that a fire out here in West Texas might set back some of our more arid native plants. We also went out and repeated our assessments the year after, so 1 year after and 2 years after, and we found those results held for at least 2 years, which is not, it would be nicer to have more longer term data, but at least for 2 years after our experimental fires, we had maintained that really low density of KR in that summer and fall burn plots. And if graphs are not your thing, here's a picture of it. This is all one summer burned plot. And in the foreground, you can see that we have these stubs of dead King Ranch bluestem. Some of them are dead, some of them are just much smaller and only resprouting a few leaves. But in the background, you can see that the Indian grass, which was exposed to the same fire, has had no problem resprouting from that summer burn. So in summary, invasive grasses cause more frequent, hotter, and larger fires in arid ecosystems. But in ecosystems that had frequent fires prior to the introduction of invasive grasses, prescribed fires may be useful tools for controlling invasive grasses, depending on the time of year. So thank you.
Yes, maybe. So I'm Kelsey. I'm currently a graduate student at Sul Ross, and one of the reasons I get to talk about invasive species is my thesis is looking at the Arundodonax, the giant river cane along the Rio Grande through Big Bend National Park, and I'm trying to look at the effects of the control measures that have been implemented and the native vegetation and how all those interactions have played out. And I've also been a river guide for 16 years. And so tamarisk and arundo are both very familiar to me in the environments I've gotten to work in. So this is maybe not near and dear to my heart, but very familiar to me. And we can start, I feel as though I've been set up really well to give this talk because the groundwork was laid very beautifully by Cheryl and Carolyn. And while we're figuring this out, just briefly, the focus of this talk, I mean, all these invasive species affect the whole, you know, from the basin to the mountains, we get something everywhere. But riparian areas in particular, our riparian areas out here, are, you know, harbor an incredible amount of diversity. And so when they're impacted, it's system-wide, the effects that you get of these, especially these two big invaders. So that'll be my focus, is riparian environments and how these really successful plants have changed them drastically. Maybe. The computer's done for the day. Oh my gosh, I know. Unless I'm cussing. Here. Patty and I have spent many hours trying to slog through arundo thickets on the Rio Grande, so. Tim Pine from the Chihuahuan Desert Monitoring and Research, Inventory and Monitoring. He is the most incredible human at thrashing through river cane that he's like a mountain gorilla. It's amazing. But even he gets defeated sometimes, and you'll just find him in this nest of dusty, stabby river cane, and he's done. Unless there's trespass cattle. We can go, I guess we don't need visuals. We can just talk about plants. So the Rio Grande, the Rio Bravo, whichever you like to call it, is our sort of lifeline down here. And it's been, we can talk about sad river systems for ever and ever, but the Rio comes through, you know, headwaters are up in Colorado, and it's down here. It's a really neat example of how human impact over especially the last century and a half has drastically altered traditional hydrology regimes. So you think of, you know, we're familiar with the Southwest, or, you know, kind of Western US. And so you think historically a river would have, you know, you get wind moves them, animals move them, we move them, and they show up in the West as people start showing up in big numbers. And so all of a sudden you have these really successful invasive plants showing up to a place that has this brand new beach that nobody, you know, the native species don't grow there because they know better, but they don't know that Elephant Butte is up there. They're like, well, we can't grow because we're going to get flooded out. And tamarisk is like, hey, I'll move in. So this happened all over the Southwest. You get all of a sudden this brand new habitat that didn't exist before, and these plants that did not evolve here. And it was this match made in heaven for them, I guess. So tamarisk, it's pretty incredible as a riparian invader. It can live in semi-arid places. You'll see it if anybody ever drives the river road. Those abandoned adobes kind of out in the creosote flats, like there'll be a big aethel tamarisk there. They do really well with drought. They do really well with inundation. They can be flooded for up to 2 years, I think. So you can throw dryness at them. You can throw a ton of water at them. They do really well in, they're halophytic, and so they do really well in saline soils, but they also don't mind alkaline soils. So they're pretty much, yeah, sure, we can handle it. We're close, I see it right there. But so they're incredibly well adapted, and then because, yeah. As they're one of their mechanisms for dealing with saline soils is they uptake the salts. And then if you ever look at a tamarisk up close, you'll see little salt crystals on their leaves. And if you're ever up close to a tamarisk, they're also really messy trees. And so as they shed those copious amounts of little scaly leaves, they're shedding salts into the soil. So they alter soil pH. In their big monocultures, hey, we'll get to tamarisk now. Oh, but first, so this is the Rio. This is, if any of you all have been to the nature walk, the amazing little wetland at the Rio Grande Village. And then this is, I think this is around Hot Springs. But so you can just see kind of the surrounding desert, and then you put water in a desert and it looks like that. And so these are those really cool photos. So that's 1901, that's Hot Springs Canyon. And then you can see this is before, so we had that big, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the big flood that happened out here in 2008. So this was before that flood. This is rephotography by a man named Dave Dean, who does a lot of hydrologic work on the river. They've got all kinds of neat monitoring stations, but you can see there's our tamarisk, there's our arundo, our giant cane. And then, so we had this flood. Picture, this is what used to happen almost every year. You had a giant flood in 2008. I'm gonna knock this over. And that's what it did. And so these are all your natives out here, and all of a sudden, most of your invaders are gone, which is really cool, but that was 2008, and they are now back. So these are, and this is just, we were talking about why rivers in general are endangered or imperiled, and then especially out west, where I think they're a lot more fragile than elsewhere. So here's our salt cedar. Yeah, have you all seen tamarisk, salt cedar? Yeah, that's what it looks like. That's what it does. You can see just those big thickets, and it's unreal. I guess I don't. In some places where the historic floodplain used to be, you'll go and there'll be hundreds, if not thousands of acres of nothing but tamarisk. They've just completely taken over the old floodplains. So to get rid of tamarisk, Cheryl showed us the invasion curve. And so there are places, like whenever I'm wandering up side streams, I'm always pulling seedlings because it feels better that way. But you can sometimes, before they get those crazy monotypic footholds, you can do things by hand, you lady with a chainsaw. And so there's, the mechanical removal can be everything from pulling seedlings to getting out your sawzall or your chainsaw. But tamarisk is really good at resprouting. So you also typically will treat it with some kind of chemical. And tamarisk is wild because everything has to be done, especially once it's taken over, everything gets done on these huge scales. So you come in with a bulldozer, or they have these enormous mulching machines. So you'll just drive this enormous mulcher through 1,000 acres of tamarisk, and you end up with this finely shredded salty mulch, and see what happens from there. But with the big mechanical removal, and then a lot of times because the stands are so dense, they'll come in and just aerially spray chemicals from a helicopter. You can't go around with your little backpack sprayer because you'd be there for your great-great-grandchildren's lives. So they're targeted, the imazapyr is for especially like just broad foliar application. They use the imazapyr. And then you can, a lot of times if you are coming through with a chainsaw, you'll cut and then somebody will spot apply chemicals once you're through. But that's what that looks like, and it's a lot of work. But then, of course, we've already introduced this thing, so why not introduce something else? So these are one of the natural predators of tamarisk. They're pretty cool. They're, as animals are, they're adapted for particular regions. And this is Dr. Chris Ritzy, who's a professor at Sul Ross. And so through all of these tests and everything, the USDA approved release of the beetles. They started out here in 2006. And it was kind of a neat release program. They had sites in Big Bend National Park. One was right by Santa Elena Canyon. They had some in Big Bend Ranch State Park. And then they got to release on private ranches near Candelaria, Ruidosa, and Presidio. And it was neat. I think it was an Uzbekistani ecomorph of the beetle, one from Crete and one from Tunisia. And each ecomorph did different, like the Tunisian beetle did really well in Candelaria for whatever reason. But so they released these beetles, and they continued to release the beetles until 2010 when funding was pulled, and so they stopped releasing beetles. But what the beetles do is they come in, and in their adult and larval forms, they just defoliate the tree. They take all the leaves away, and so you'll see they were never released in Grand Canyon, but you could see where they come in the side drainages, and over the years, just the downstream swaths of yellow and then dead tamarisk. And so typically where they're from, the tamarisk can re-leaf in as little as 3 weeks. But out here, the beetles don't have anything else to eat. And so you get these huge infestations, and they'll just keep defoliating the tree. And so the tree can't photosynthesize. It uses up all its reserves and eventually loses vigor and dies, is how the beetle works. My question is what happens when the beetle runs out of food? But so that's a defoliated tamarisk. You'll see that. And then a lot of times if you wander up to that tamarisk, there'll be adult beetles flying all over, and you can see the larvae on the leaves, and it's pretty wild. They do a very good job at what they're introduced to do. So we've got biocontrol for tamarisk, and then my friend Arundo. So this is Arundodonax, the giant river cane. Again, introduced by us, did really well out here. It is also, it forms these big monotypic stands. And one of the things Arundo has actually contributed more to altering the hydrology of the Rio Grande than it's probably done an equal amount as just not having any water, because it's rhizomatous. So in all of my research, they say that it doesn't produce viable seed in its invaded range. So it reproduces solely vegetatively. So sometimes you'll see people like, hey, we're going to come control the cane, and they chop down a bunch of cane and they send it downriver, and it's like, have some cane. So it forms these dense rhizomatous mats. Like when you come in after they've burnt the cane, you'll post hole in 6 to 8 feet of roots sometimes. So it's part of what's contributing to the channelization of the river. And it also makes it really successful, as even when you do have a flood, you know, you're just washing it downstream, and it layers also. So if you ever, it can send out roots from its stems. So it reproduces that way. So all of a sudden, you get areas, I mean, that's insane. So I think this is down in the lower Rio Grande Valley, but this is Dr. Jay Goolsby, who we will talk about in a couple slides, but this is our stretch of the Rio. I think this is going down into Black Gap, but you can just see all of that green that you see along the river is almost entirely Arundodonax. So it is also controlled. This is kind of fun. Fire is a really good control mechanism. And Arundo, when I first showed up, I think my first year out here was 2008. So it's just after the flood, and some very intelligent people thought, let's capitalize on this absence of giant river cane. And so they started control efforts. So to control Arundodonax, you come in and you burn it, you set it on fire. And so this is my friend Jeff Kelch watching the fire. But so yeah, huge swaths. And when I first showed up, they were just doing it on the Texas side. So river left would have no cane, but then the Mexican side was just a full bank of cane. I was like, this doesn't seem like it's that smart. And then they got all the cool Mexican entities on board. And so now it's this amazing binational effort. Like when you go on cane killing trips, you get to hang out with the Diablos and who's the fire crew in Big Bend National Park. But it's really fun and an amazing joint effort to try and do something about this. So you burn it. Cane is really fire adapted, so it resprouts really quickly. So then you come in as it's resprouting and you spray it with a Mazapir. And that again does the same thing to the tamarisk. The plant can't photosynthesize, and so eventually, ideally, you're killing these stands, and they come back every year. And it's been amazing seeing the changes wrought by their control efforts. You can see some of this, you know, these are all stretches of burnt cane through here, and you can kind of see the encroachment of native species back in. They also have biocontrol mechanisms. There are 4 different insects that they're looking at, and obviously for these really significant invaders, tons of research, tons of money is poured in annually to figure out what to do about them. For the cane, there's a gall wasp and a scale insect that were experimentally introduced by Dr. Goolsby in 2017, I believe, and then reintroduced in 2018. And there's been no successful establishment that I know of. We found a few little exit holes at the Santa Elena boat ramp, but the populations haven't stabilized and would probably require subsequent introduction. They estimate if the wasp is successful, it can probably travel downstream at 25 kilometers annually. So it can get moving. For those of you familiar with scale insects, the scale insects are not expected to be so mobile. But yeah, so this is what my thesis is looking at, is they did a lot of the mechanical and chemical control of cane without any surveys as to what was there previously. And then it's, okay, let's throw another organism into the mix, but what was there? Was this successful? You know, so I'm doing riparian transects to see how the treatment has affected native stands of vegetation, how the biodiversity compares with just native stands that haven't been affected by cane, but bless them. Yeah, that's what I want to look at, because that's my curiosity is, and with all these invasives, is it working? Is it worth doing? Is it a bad idea? But so that's the thing is we keep throwing further factors into these mixes. It's like, well, we messed that up, but let's just try something else. And I wonder about, how all that goes. And I think one of the things to keep in mind with all of this, I was talking to a botanist in Grand Canyon, and there was some folks, some passengers, and they were asking about the restoration efforts. And the botanist said, well, we don't really call it restoration anymore, because what are you restoring it to? The whole ecosystem has been totally changed. You're not going to take it back to the way it was. So where's your benchmark? What do you want it to look like? And so now they're calling it in Grand Canyon, it's revegetation. So in the place of all this dead tamarisk, they're planting things that, maybe this will work. But one of the problems is like the southwestern willow flycatcher. because the tamarisk outcompeted all the willows. So now the southwestern willow flycatcher nests in tamarisk. And so you're like, well, you come in and you bulldoze all the tamarisk, where does the flycatcher go? So there's so many complicated questions with this, but that's, I mean, having some kind of management and monitoring that is comprehensive, but also really flexible, because we don't know what it's going to look like and what's going to change. But yeah, those are my two invaders.
Before I dwelled as a botanical scribe in the ecotone of science and policy, I served as the plant ecologist at a place called Lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge, which are the red tracts of land you see in the Rio Grande Delta at the very southern tip of Texas. And my job there was to direct a habitat restoration program where we were striving to restore native plant communities on cropland that had been acquired by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And here we're looking at some of the predominant vegetation types in the Rio Grande Delta, which oh, try this. This one works again. Okay, wonderful. You know, in the upper left, you can see sable palm forest. If you've ever gone down there, you can visit the Gorgas Science Foundation's sable palm forest, which used to be the Audubon sable palm forest. We have subtropical thorn forests, shrub savannas, and arid shrublands, among other vegetation types. And so the idea was, because that the remaining habitat types probably represented maybe 5% of the land area, they were highly fragmented. And the idea was to kind of interconnect all of these fragments in a wildlife corridor by restoring native vegetation on cropland, as you can see in the upper left. The ultimate goal of the refuge, which will reach, I believe, over 200,000 acres in size, is to restore more than 50,000 acres of vegetation. And the main problem with this project has been, since the very beginning, the competition from invasive grasses that are introduced. There are three main species of introduced invasive grasses that we dealt with, and I estimate that those three species together comprise more than 99% of the grass biomass in the Rio Grande Delta. And these species are guinea grass, buffalo grass, and clayburg bluestem. And I want to pause and raise the question that must be in all of your minds: what makes a species invasive? And I think the first thing is that in their native lands, all of these species are adventive, or, you know, they're great colonizers of disturbed habitats. So they're just really good at that. And the second thing is, when they were brought over, they came over without the many enemies that all organisms acquire over time, parasites and pathogens that evolve to eat them and kind of hold them in check. So they come without any enemies, and you give them an opportunity through disturbance, and they reproduce like crazy. So guinea grass has been known as Panicum maximum, Eurocloa maxima, Megathyrsus maximus, Megathyrsus infestant. Anyway, they're still working that out. But we have two varieties present in the Rio Grande Delta. You can see in the photograph there behind the person, the really tall grass there, getting up, about 10 feet tall, is this is actually the more common variety of guinea grass that has been planted throughout the humid tropics, but it originated in, we believe, in West Africa. Now that particular variety has very little cold tolerance. It requires full sun. It's very erect and tall, as you can see. You don't really see a lot of it in the Delta. It's really just in the Brownsville area, and it's not very common. But the variety that you see in front of the lady is a more scandent variety that is a little more cold tolerant, and it has some shade tolerance, so it will grow in and among the native shrubs and trees, and it will prop itself up on them and grow through the trees, easily reaching 10 or 12 feet in height. And then, it grows furiously fast during humid weather, and then dries out. And all you need is one spark, and you've got this finely divided mixture of air and fuel, and those fires burn frighteningly fast and hot. We believe from anecdotal evidence that it spreads in bird droppings. Buffalo grass, I think many of you may be familiar with. There is almost contiguous swath of buffalo grass at, say, I'm going to say roughly 25 to 27 degrees latitude from the Gulf of Mexico to the Sea of Cortez. You can almost see its, you can pretty much see its signature in satellite photographs. It also originated in Africa. The varieties that eventually were found that did well in South Texas originated in Kenya. And those seeds spread very easily by wind. Now, Clay, we've heard about King Ranch bluestem, and I think most of you are familiar with KRB. There's another KRB, Clayburgh bluestem, which is actually quite closely related. And there was really a sort of a species cluster coming from mostly Southeast Asia, all the way into the Middle East, of closely related, both Rheocloas and Dicanthemums, and they were all brought over. And I think once arriving in the New World, there's been gene flow between and among them. So it's kind of hard to tell them apart anymore. So we just use a generic term of Old World blue stems. But within that spectrum, within that species complex, Clayburgh bluestem is a subtropical variety that grows in heavy clay soils of bottomlands, deltas, and floodplains. One thing they discovered about these Old World blue stems, that initially they were thought to outperform natives in pastures, and then later it was discovered that part of the reason is that grazing animals do not like to eat them, and will only do so when everything else has been depleted. So, oops, that was a mistake. Well, anyway, obviously in any attempt to control invasive plants, the first step is you got to get rid of any of these invasives that are there. Now, I have seen countless efforts to restore natives where there would be an application of glyphosate or some other herbicide, Roundup, and after 2-3 weeks, it's all high fives because you see, a sea of dead grass. And you're like, yay, we did it. Okay, now let's spend tens of thousands of dollars on native plant materials, seeds, seedlings. You put all this effort in this project, and looks like your natives are established, and then the people who make the decisions are like, well, we did a good job, they get promotions, and they move on. And within a year, the area starts to become dominated by the invasive grasses again. And it looks like you know, basically you'd never been there, you had never done anything at all, and all that money and effort was wasted. And I think that what's happening is that these grasses create resistant structures such as rhizomes or just dormant tillers. And because they're dormant and they're held in dormancy while at the, you know, by the existing vegetation, you know, they're being repressed or suppressed by the culms that are actively growing. So when you apply a herbicide like glyphosate, it is not absorbed into these dormant tissues. So part of the plant dies, and then they stop making hormones, and that releases the rhizomes and the dormant tillers that didn't absorb the herbicide, and then they start growing. So if you're going to go the herbicide route, plan on repeating that application. You know, if you're dealing with buffalo grass, if you're dealing with clayberg bluestem, I would say at least 4 times, and spread that out and time it very carefully over perhaps a year. And then, of course, you still have to deal with all the seeds that have been absorbed into the soil seed bank. And we really have no idea how long they remain viable. Anyway, okay, so there's my hypothesis that these plants, you know, these are plants that were hit with glyphosate, they died, and then you just see the resprouts coming in. Oh, establishing native trees and shrubs in the Rio Grande Delta is a doable thing. We learned how to collect and process the seeds. We can grow seedlings. We can plant them following rainfall. We were pretty good at that. As you see in the photograph on the left, you see a reasonable stand of native shrubs and trees, but underneath it, what happened is a few years after we planted the trees, clayberg bluestem just blew in off of a nearby levee, and it just took over the understory. So now you have a very vulnerable situation where a fire can come in and, you know, it'll just burn through the whole thing, and some of the shrubs will die, some of them will be able to resprout, but every time there's a fire, you keep driving that community towards the invasive grass. Now, I was driving down the highway on the way to work, and it was really annoying that there was sort of an illicit trash pile that was accumulating on the side of the road. And then one day I noticed that someone had set it on fire and kind of singed the edge of a neighbor adjacent stand of native vegetation. But within the next year, and actually within a few months, that area suddenly exploded with a native plant in the mallow family, a small shrub called the amantillo, or Abutilon trisulcatum. You see a photograph there in the upper left. Actually, I'm told right in here, that's all amantillo. Look at this colony that formed here. See, and wherever I noticed, wherever it established, these invasive grasses couldn't really quite go up to it. They would stop before they got to it. So there may have been some allelopathy going on there. Now, another species that was really good at this used to be called Eupatorium odoratum. Now it's Chromolaena odorata. They call it Crucita down there. And same thing, whenever that plant blew in, it would form these very nice colonies, and the invasive grasses left it alone. And so I got the idea, hey, you know, let's incorporate these in our seedling mix. And there's probably 8 or 10 species that you know, worked really well in this fashion. And the interesting thing is all of these are great butterfly plants. So let me show you a few examples of where we actually did this. This is an aerial photograph of part of a tract near Harlingen that called Resaca de los Fresnos. And the orange bordered polygons are individual crop fields that year by year we would attempt to revegetate. So this area was planted in 1998, and it's almost 57 acres in size. And I used a lot of these understory shrubs to try to keep the grass out. Now that field immediately north of it or above it, for some reason that was allowed to go fallow. And it was just, you know, rib cage high clayberg blue stem so thick, you know, you almost couldn't walk through it. Now, this photograph was taken on July 7th, 2005. Interestingly enough, a few weeks after that, there was a wildfire, and it started in the middle of the night. So by the time our fire crew found out about it, it had pretty much burned as far as it was going to go. When they got there, they just had to do some, you know, it was just backfiring, and they put it out. And I was sent out to GPS it, and I apologize that I have not been able to find that GPS file, but the sort of lime or the yellowish or turquoise green line there represents what pretty much what I think that fire perimeter was. And what happened is it burned right up to the edge of that revegetated field and stopped. At a few places it made little inroads, but it would just stop. And that really I thought was very curious. So I went out there a bit later. I don't know if any of you know the gentleman there. His name is Bentham Basham, and he is quite a butterfly expert, but I brought him with me. And we could see that what happened is the fire burned right up to the stands of that amantillo and the crucita, and it just stopped. And it stopped because there wasn't any invasive grass growing in amongst it. So I was very pleased to see that. And here's the most recent aerial photograph I can find, taken just about a year ago. And you can see that we really have a nice stand of native Tamaulipan shrubland there that's great wildlife habitat. And it's also, it's not just habitat for, you know, warm, fuzzy mammals that remind us of us, but it's a great habitat for butterflies. And it's very interesting to point out that Hidalgo County, just one county in South Texas, has more species of butterflies than the entire eastern United States, east of the Mississippi River. One last project I'll tell you about, which was the very last restoration project I worked on in the Rio Grande Delta. The aerial photograph here shows the, let me get my pointer again. Let's see if I get that. This right here is the remaining stand of sable palm forest right there. And here's some abandoned cropland. And then this whole tract here is called Boscaje de la Palma. And it was actually one of the very first tracts of land acquired for the lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge in 1981. And at that time, they thought, let's just take all this farmland and we'll just walk away from it and it will turn into habitat. Well, they were wrong. It was just completely colonized with invasive grass. And we have a problem. Here's a Rio Grande, you can see there. And on this side is Matamoros, Tamaulipas. And there was a trash dump over here. And every now and then people would set fire to the trash dump. And the prevailing winds would carry burning cardboard across the river like that. And so this whole area would catch fire almost every year. And it just completely prevented any native succession from taking place. So in 2004, our managers kind of ordered us to do something about this and make some native vegetation happen. So we decided to conduct a series of trials. And some of the folks felt that, you know, we have so much land to deal with. Let's look for some easy way to do this. So they wanted to aerially apply Fusilade, which is a grass-specific herbicide. The only problem is Fusilade it is grass-specific, but it's not a really powerful herbicide. And aerial application is really dicey, especially when you're talking about, I mean, you can't see, if you can see in this aerial photograph, there are a few standing trees out there. So the guy flying that plane, he's not gonna, you may have seen aerial pesticide application where they just come right down on top of the crop, but he couldn't bring that thing below about 25 feet. So I was like, let's try some other things as well. So zooming in again, you can see these two fields here, which were about 5 acres. What we had done is initially we did some prescribed burning just to reduce the amount of material. And herbicide always works best on freshly growing grasses. And then this area here, I disked it up with a farm tractor and a disc harrow 4 times over the summer, while this area got 2 applications of glyphosate. And then this whole area got 4 more applications of glyphosate over the next year. So after a year and a half of work, this is what it looked like. The areas that got Fusilade briefly turned kind of a yellowish color, and then they just immediately resumed growth. So essentially nothing happened there except that we spent money. And the area that was disked and then herbicided was really clean. And the area that got herbicide alone was still, it wasn't 100% free of Clayburgh bluestem, but almost, and it was good enough to plant native vegetation on. And this aerial photograph is from 2016, and I had the opportunity to go back, and we walked through all of these fields. So the area that had gotten Fusilade, it is actually getting some native trees. They're mostly just tepewahe, and there is a lot of Clayburgh bluestem growing underneath it. So we're not getting a native understory being restored there. But these other areas that got a more intensive treatment, the understory was a solid wall of these shrubs that we had planted. And they were almost 100% effective in keeping out any of the invasive grass. It would not carry a fire. And the other native trees and shrubs that we planted there were establishing through the understory shrubs. So that was, in my 16 years of experience there, that was the most successful attempt we'd ever made at turning an invasive grass community back into natives. I have one last slide. I've shared this information with others. This photograph is of an ongoing project at the National Butterfly Center, south of Mission, which is a wonderful small operation that if you get down there, you definitely want to go see. And they're working with us to restore populations of an endangered shrub called the Tamaulipan kidney petal, which is this plant that you can see all over in here. And they followed my instructions, and they were very diligent and knocked back the Clayburgh bluestem for more than a year. And then they planted, I believe they planted 120 of these shrubs, and they have well over 200 now. It's basically the population has doubled through spontaneous reproduction. And what's significant about this is that they have completely replicated one of the 5 remaining populations of this plant that occur in South Texas. And so we're moving forward now, and they're going to continue to plant these habitat islands that each replicate one of the 5 remaining populations. And that way we increase that redundancy that I talked about before. So if some terrible thing happens and one of the natural populations is lost, we have its genes. We will have its genes replicated in this site. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation. Oh, next question.
See how this goes.
Yeah.
Testing. Hey, all right. So my question, Chris, is kind of more a hands-on question. You said one of the ways you fought the Cleburne blue stem successfully was the repeated summer tillings and then glyphosate on a repeated basis. How did you control erosion during both of those phases?
Yeah, that's of course a great question. And one thing about the Rio Grande Delta is it's extraordinarily flat. So erosion wasn't an issue there. Right. Again, Clayburgh likes heavy clays. But, and the other thing is that you're talking about a pretty short term period when soil is left bare, and soil does not stay bare very long in the Rio Grande Delta. It will quickly fill up with something. So did anybody? Yes.
I think that was a very good question from the perspective of going back to what we've all said. It's very important to have a plan in place, because you don't want to make a decision to tackle an invasive and then find out that you have created yet another set of unintended consequences. So, you know, there's an old adage, when in doubt, do nothing. It's pretty hard for me to say that because I, often feel so overwhelmed by all of these invasives. But over the last 15 years, I've come to the conclusion that we can't take it down unless we know what we're putting in its place.
Oh, there we go. Yes. In other words, you're asking if any of our invasive plants are genetically modified organisms.
It sounds like everything's introduced, but anything that we've modified.
Not to my knowledge, but to me, it seems inevitable. For example, we heard that a major agricultural industrial company was attempting to make genetically modified sorghum that would be Roundup resistant. So hooray, we can plant sorghum and you can spray Roundup on it and it won't die, Now this same company made a lot of money selling, developing and selling glyphosate herbicide known as Roundup. Initially in the early 1970s, and it was a boon to agriculture because this was something farmers could do to fight Johnson grass. All right. Now, Johnson grass, Sorghum halepense, is closely related to sorghum bicolor. And there are known instances of gene flow between them. So if you introduce Roundup resistance into sorghum, there is the possibility that it could get into Johnson grass, which would defeat the initial purpose of development of glyphosate herbicide in the first place. So we're like, are you crazy? And I left out an adjective. And do you guys want? Next question. What is it? Cookie time already? Coffee time. Yeah. Happy hour. Please feel free to track us down during the afternoon and evening, and we'll answer other questions that come up. And many thanks to our